Meade had a correct my understanding of this. Meade
Yes.
had an original plan that included Little Round Top at the end of
Yeah.
the fish hook. Sickles then, in spite of that, for whatever reasons, debated on another presentation, um, moved that line up. Okay, but it was Strong Vincent that put them back on the hill.
Yes.
That's fascinating. In all the discussions about Sickles and all, I still have never heard Strong Vincent being part of that story.
Mhm.
I think that's a very cool thing. It's kind of shocking to me a little bit.
I wanted to take my opportunity before I really get started to express my appreciation to the Grand Army of the Republic Museum and Archive for having me today because I'm, of course, a descendant of a couple of Grand Army members, and it's very important that the legacy of the Grand Army continue to be remembered because of the incredible amount of work they did for Northern Civil War veterans after the war in terms of their advocacy on their behalf with regards to pensions, with regards to their long history of advocacy on behalf of medical care and better accommodations for them throughout things like government bureaucracy and housing and old age care and treatment. And it's an incredibly humbling experience to be here today. But you're not here to listen to me wax philosophic about the Grand Army of the Republic. You're here to listen to me talk to you about how Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain has sort of been lying to all of you for 161 years, which is a little bit of a controversial statement, but I always want to preface that by saying that I don't want to knock Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain off, the pedestal he's been put on. Joshua Chamberlain and the 20th Maine were incredibly heroic for what they did on July 2nd, 1863. There is nothing beyond question but the fact that their bayonet charge at Gettysburg was an inspired moment of heroism at an incredible pivotal moment in the history of the United States. But it is not the whole story. And it has far too often been distilled down to being the whole story. And when it becomes the whole story, it is often to the detriment of our larger historical understanding. Now, I'm from Erie, Pennsylvania, and Erie, Pennsylvania is where Strong Vincent, who was Chamberlain's brigade commander, was from. And I was at Gettysburg a month before the sesquicentennial in June of 2013. And I thought to myself, we hear Chamberlain, Chamberlain, Chamberlain. We always hear Chamberlain. Why is it we never hear about Strong Vincent? And that was the thought that was the real genesis behind my book. That was what really made me start to think about how is it that we've forgotten about Strong Vincent. And what I want to talk to you about today is not only what happened on July 2nd, 1863, but the process by which we have forgotten largely Strong Vincent and the other men of the 3rd Brigade, 1st Division, 5th Army Corps beyond the 20th Maine. And I always like to start out when I'm talking about my book by saying that I'm not slighting the men of the 20th Maine or Joshua Chamberlain. Because after my book came out, I got some very nasty reviews out of Maine because they thought I was coming after the native sons. And I'm not. Because as I say in the conclusion of my book, the laurels of Round Top are large enough to be shared with all of the various claimants. And I do believe that is true. And with that being said, I'm going to share my screen with you, and we're going to start going through the fun little PowerPoint I've put together here. Now, I hope we can all see this. Bernice, you're showing up in my sidebar. If you can see this, can you get me a sign, a thumbs up, a nod of the head or something? Okay, I see the thumbs up. Thank you, Bernice. So we're going to start by talking about what we think we know about July 2nd, 1863, because it's really a historical representation that has been shaped and morphed by falsehood, by myth making. And so much of that is built around the 20th May. And in a lot of cases, that can be traced back to Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain himself. As I said, he is without a doubt a hero, a brilliantly brave man who put himself in the line of fire multiple times for the sake of his country. But as we'll see as we go through this, he was not above self-promoting. He was not above giving himself credit where it was not necessarily deserved. We'll start with a little bit of background on Strong Vincent. He was born June 17th, 1837 in the village of Waterford, about 15 miles south of Erie. He grew up in Erie. His father ran a forging firm in the city. They were a relatively wealthy family, but his father was a man who didn't care much for the idea of the idle rich. He very much insisted that his children should keep active, should find themselves something useful to do with their lives. There's a quote from a family history written by another son, Bethuel, who went on to become an Episcopal priest, that had his father once proclaiming to his sons, "No idle boys about me, you must get to it and keep your hand in it." And Strong attended Trinity College in Hartford, Connecticut. He was either asked to leave or expelled. The historical record is not necessarily clear. After an incident involving a night watchman, where he assaulted the night watchman after he'd made a comment impugning the honor of the woman he was courting, Elizabeth Carter. His father then arranged for him to enroll in Harvard University, where he managed to achieve an education as a lawyer. Passed the Pennsylvania bar on December 12th, 1860, and of course, just a few days later, South Carolina secedes from the federal union. Strong Vincent's one of the first men in Erie County to enlist, shortly following President Lincoln's call for volunteers in April 1861. And as you can see by this little timeline here, he rather rapidly rises through the ranks. He's a second lieutenant upon his enlistment. He's a major by September. By that same month, he's lieutenant colonel. He's full colonel by July of 62. And then he is colonel commanding the brigade in May of 1863. That's a pretty rapid rise in the ranks for a guy with absolutely no military experience. And it's as colonel commanding the brigade that we come to Gettysburg. And of course, the story we all know of July 2nd, 1863, has Dan Sickles advancing the Third Corps, leaving Little Round Top exposed to a flank attack. Gouverneur Warren goes up Little Round Top, famously stands on his boulder with his field glasses, looks out and sees the glint of Confederate bayonets in the trees as the shell goes flying over their heads, and calls for reinforcements. And that's where things get murky for a little bit, because there's about 15 different accounts of how troops wound up being there. And then we have Joshua Chamberlain and the 20th Maine holding the left end of the federal line. That's the story we always hear in Ken Burns' The Civil War, in Michael Shara's The Killer Angels, in Sir John Keegan's The American Civil War, in almost every single one-volume history of the war. That is Gettysburg as it is portrayed. That is Gettysburg as the popular audience knows it. And the 20th Maine saves the Federal Army at Gettysburg when they make their bayonet charge after they run out of ammunition. But that story is a little simplistic, because Warren's call for reinforcements for Little Round Top first goes to Dan Sickles' headquarters at the Trossel Farm. And Sickles, who of course is heavily under attack by this point, says he can't spare any men. And Warren's aide then runs into George Sykes, 5th Corps commander on the road. Sykes says he can spare some men and sends his own aide to find James Barnes, commanding the 1st Division. Barnes sends, excuse me, I misspoke there. The aide from Sykes is looking for General Barnes and comes across Vincent. And Vincent seizes the aide and says, "What are your orders? Give me your orders." The aide says, "Where is General Barnes?" Vincent says, "What are your orders? Give me your orders." General Sykes directs General Barnes to take a brigade to hold that hill yonder. And without any orders to do so, Vincent says, "I will take the responsibility of moving my brigade there myself." Now that to me is the crucial point, because Vincent moved his brigade to Little Round Top without orders. If the Confederates had failed to attack the hill, if there had been no Confederate forces that attempted to come over Little Round Top, he almost certainly would have been charged with dereliction of duty. And as it were, the approximately 1,300 men of Vincent's brigade, the 44th New York, the 20th Maine, the 83rd Pennsylvania, the 16th Michigan, by the time they're deploying on a little spur of rock closer to the base of Little Round Top than to its crest, so Gouverneur Warren can't see them, by the time they're deploying there, it's less than 5 minutes before they are fully deployed in line of battle that the Confederates are hitting them in a full force frontal attack out of the Valley of Death. There had not been a minute to waste. And it was Vincent's initiative that ensured Little Round Top was held at all. And these Confederate attacks are chaotic. While the Federal defenders, while Vincent's brigade has Vincent as a central organizing commanding figure, the Confederates don't have a central organizing commanding figure. It's elements of 3 different brigades, 2 different divisions that are smashing into Vincent's brigade. There's no one telling them to charge in this formation or this wave. There's just individual regimental commanders blindly feeling their way forward. There is no unit cooperation or cohesion between the Confederate forces on Little Round Top. By the time Chamberlain and the 20th Maine make their famous bayonet charge, the 140th New York under Colonel Patrick O'Rourke had additionally arrived on Little Round Top with an additional 500 men. O'Rourke had also been killed in the course of this arrival, hence the reason he has a lovely monument now on top of the hill with a nose everyone likes to rub that's so shiny because of that. And if you go through the after-action reports from the Confederate commanders and from the various Federal commanders on the hill, and you start working out the timeline, and then you start looking at the individual soldiers' accounts, you realize that the 15th Alabama, the 20th Maine's nemesis on the field, as it were, by the time the 20th Maine made its famous bayonet charge, they were the last Confederate regiment left attacking. Every other Confederate regiment that had been attacking the brigade had withdrawn because of the force of opposition they had met. And so the immediate urgency of the situation is not as dire as it had immediately seemed. Which, again, is not to downplay the bravery involved, because certainly it takes a lot of guts to charge at an enemy who is still shooting at you with a knife strapped onto the end of your musket, basically. but it was not the make or break moment of the battle that it has been made out to be in subsequent decades. More or less, the 20th Maine and 15th Alabama are pretty evenly matched in terms of manpower. I'll be discussing that a little bit later in this presentation. It's not the massively outnumbering situation that we often hear about in these situations. And at the height of the fighting there on Little Round Top, Vincent's mortally wounded. He gets shot through the left hip and pelvis and dies on July 7th, 5 days later, at the age of 26. And here we have, as I argue in my book, the officers, plural, who held Little Round Top. We have Strong Vincent, James Rice of the 44th New York, Joshua Chamberlain of the 20th Maine, Orpheus Woodward of the 83rd Pennsylvania, Norval Welch of the 16th Michigan, Patrick O'Rourke of the 140th New York, and Captain Charles Hazlitt of the 5th United States Artillery. Without all of these officers, I do not believe the hill would have been held. But without Vincent in particular, who seized the initiative to take the defense of the hill without the orders to do so, none of the rest of them would have had the opportunity to defend the hill. And that is the key and crucial part of the argument I advance in my book, that Vincent is the one man, if any one man deserves the lion's share of the credit, who does deserve that honor. But how is it that the narrative we know, the narrative we see in Ron Maxwell's 1993 film with Jeff Daniels working around a fake mustache to sell us on his being a rhetoric professor from Maine, or that David McCulloch tells us about his dulcet tones in Ken Burns' The Civil War. How did that narrative come to dominate and suppress the actual narrative of what happened? It starts almost immediately after the war. It starts with Chamberlain launching a speaking tour throughout New England and the adjoining states that really emphasizes his personal heroism and the exploits of the 20th Maine. And now there's nothing really unusual about that. I mean, we know the history of the Civil War and its immediate aftermath. We know, throw a quarter, hit a speaking tour after the war. But Chamberlain is a little different. Part of his, we'd call it today a rider, the agreement the artist signs before a lecture or a concert where they can only have the green M&Ms in their dressing room or whatever. Part of Chamberlain's speaking rider was that he must be greeted to venues he entered with a performance of See the Conquering Hero Comes from Judas Maccabeus by George Friedrich Handel. And that seems a little vainglorious to me, but that's neither here nor there. That's a little suspicious, but I'm not about to condemn the man for it. He, of course, serves 4 terms as governor of Maine and becomes president of Bowdoin College. And from there, we then have to travel a little south to Dixie for what comes next, because in the 1870s, as we know, the lost cause of the Confederacy is starting to flourish. Pendleton and Jubal Early are tearing Longstreet apart. They're trying to pin on him the blame for the defeated Gettysburg. And Longstreet fires back. He writes an account of the battle on the right at Gettysburg in the Southern Historical Society papers. And William Oates, who had commanded the 15th Alabama, really took offense to Longstreet's narrative of that engagement. And he writes his own version. And in the heat of his anger, he makes a very bad mistake. He says that his regiment went into battle with 644 men and 42 officers. They actually had around 499 men mustered at dawn on July 2nd. And that's exempting men who were dispatched, and that does not include men who were later dispatched to go capture federal wagons between the Round Tops who were sent to fill their canteens at the base of Big Round Top. And so realistically, it's likely that the 15th Alabama engaged the 20th Maine with around 430, 450 men, which is around the exact same size of the 20th Maine. But Howard Prince, the official regimental historian of the 20th Maine, seizes that 644 men number and immediately starts using it to wave in the face of everyone the incredible, overwhelming odds his regiment had faced at Gettysburg. Because why wouldn't he? He's taking it as an authority. He doesn't know Oates has made a mistake. He's saying, look at what me and my brothers in arms did. And he does not know he's perpetuating a falsehood because Oates has made a mistake in a heat of anger. Oates will eventually try and walk back the figure in his memoir published in 1905, but by that point, the genie's out of the bottle. The number's already out there. It's already being used by everyone. A few years after that, Theodore Garish, who'd served in Company H of the 20th Maine, publishes his memoir called Army Life. And as John Pullen, who wrote the 20th century regimental history of the 20th Maine, once said, books are built upon other books, and very few books on the Civil War have been built upon more than Garish. Everybody quotes Garish because it's an easy, breezy read. It's very accessible. It makes a prodigious use of the personal eye, and it's about his life as a soldier in the 20th Maine in the American Civil War. But Garish wasn't with the regiment at Gettysburg. He was at an army hospital in Philadelphia. Yet he presents the battle as though he was there, talking about events that he could not possibly have witnessed, including, among other things, the death of his tent mate. Everything in that chapter is at best secondhand, at worst, potentially outright fabrication. But Garish's account of Gettysburg became one of the gold star narratives of the battle. Other members of the 20th Maine push back at it once it's published. One of the company commanding officers publishes an open letter in the Lincoln County Maine News, calling it a pack of lies. Chamberlain writes a letter to Garish. The whole letter has not survived. A couple of pages of it have, and it seems he was less than pleased with it because the few pages that have survived are Chamberlain laying out in painstaking detail his own version of events of what happened on Little Round Top. And then, just a few years after that, the War of the Rebellion, the official records, are being published. And as the War Department's going through its files, they find the 20th Maine's official report on Gettysburg is missing. So the clerk responsible for collecting these records writes to Chamberlain and asks him to send them a copy of it. Chamberlain sends back about 6 pages with a certification by himself that it is an exact copy of the original from his personal files. Now, I cannot take credit for this discovery. I have to thank Thomas Desjardins, the wonderful historian of the 20th Maine, in his book on the legacy and memory of Gettysburg. He's honored dead for uncovering this. It's not, of course, the original report. Chamberlain refers to the hill they fought on as Little Round Top, which, on something dated July 6, 1863, he would not have done so. Little Round Top was not named that until 1867. In fact, in correspondence dated that same day to his wife and others, Chamberlain referred to it as Wolf Hill or Sugarloaf Hill. Chamberlain specifically mentions in this report he gave to the War Department the deaths of Captain Charles Billings, Lieutenant Arrett Linscott, and Lieutenant Warren Kendall. Only Kendall had died by July 6th. The others would die later in the month. And it's 2,500 words of very well written, very detailed prose with no real evidence of having been rewritten or edited or having anything crossed out, which doesn't really fit with the idea of anything written while in an army on the march. And so Desjardins started hunting to see if he could find the original report. And he could. It's in the Maine State Archives in Augusta. It's around 1,000 words shorter. It shows evidence of editing and revision and things crossed out, as would be expected in an army on the march. It does not use the name Little Round Top. It does not refer to the deaths of people who were not yet dead. And it, very intriguingly, doesn't even go anywhere near as in depth as the one written almost 20 years later. And so what's fascinating about this, for whatever reason, because there will never be a smoking gun that will be found about this, I will bet my life, never find a letter from Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain saying, I am giving this report to the War Department to publish because X, Y, or Z. But for whatever reason, Joshua Chamberlain chose to falsify his official report on the Battle of Gettysburg for publication in the official records of the American Civil War that has been cited by generations of historians. I would argue those 6 pages in the official records are probably the most cited pages out of the entire volumes, all 3 volumes on the Battle of Gettysburg. And they're a forgery insofar as they were written 20 years later. To keep compounding on this, Chamberlain keeps himself in the news throughout the 1890s throughout a very public feud with William Oates of the 15th Alabama over the placement of the 15th Alabama's monument at Gettysburg. Oates wants to place the Alabama Boys monument at the furthest point of advance of the regiment. Chamberlain insists they never reach that point. The 15th Alabama at one point had almost fully enveloped the 20th Maine, which had fused back on itself like a hairpin. The Alabama troops had filled in around it. Oates wanted to put the monument up here, which would have put it uphill of the 20th Maine monument. Chamberlain refused to admit they'd ever made it that far. And he won the argument. The 15th Alabama still does not have a monument at Gettysburg to this day. Oates later complained to John Robbins, the only Southern member of the Gettysburg Battlefield Memorial Association. He is, like many others at this point, contented to make himself the whole push of the affair. In 1912 and 1913, for the 50th anniversary of the battles, Chamberlain published My Story of Fredericksburg and Through Blood and Fire at Gettysburg, a pair of articles in Cosmopolitan and Hearst magazines. They are very sensationalized, very lurid, and very unlike anything Chamberlain normally wrote. This exhibits evidence of the interfering hand of the editors of the William Randolph Hearst magazine syndicates. It's known Chamberlain was less than pleased by the results of the Gettysburg article in particular, saying they were much curtailed and changed by the insertion of connective tissue by the editor. However, that account of the Battle of Gettysburg, Through Blood and Fire at Gettysburg, remains incredibly popular and remains one of the most common sources of the battle and is very, very much still in print and very frequently still included in anthologies of soldiers' accounts. His death in 1914 temporarily halted the spread of the myth, but I do say temporarily because it won't be long before it continues again. In In fact, it's only 24 years. Kenneth Roberts, a novelist from Maine, working during the Great Depression as part of the Works Progress Administration's Federal Writers Project, writes Trending into Maine, a travel log and love letter to his native state, part of the Works Progress Administration's program to bolster tourism to each of the states. And in that novel, he includes the chapter Maine Stories I'd Love to Write, which are some strange and fascinating stories about Maine and Mainers that he'd heard over the years. And most of that chapter is taken up by Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain and the 20th Maine at Gettysburg, and how they had saved the Union Army and saved the United States that day. And to read Roberts' account, you'd think they stood alone on that hill. A few years later, 1948, he responds to Arnold Toynbee, who had insisted that Maine was an uncultured and civilized provincial backwater, in the Saturday Evening Post, with "Don't say that about Maine." Saturday Evening Post, of course, huge national circulating publication, and in his article rebutting Toynbee's assertions, Chamberlain and the 20th Maine become the central linchpin of Roberts' argument about how Maine had saved the United States and thus was just as worthy of love and respect as any other state in the Union. It was that article, and then Trending into Maine, that made John J. Pullen decide to write the 20th Maine, a volunteer regiment in the Civil War, in 1957. It remains to this day the single best-selling one-volume history of the 20th Maine, partially because it wound up in Reader's Digest the next year. That kicked off a huge wave of fascination in Chamberlain and the 20th Maine, including the first full biography of Chamberlain, Willard Wallace's Soul of the Lion, that was published in 1960. It was from Soul of the Lion that Michael Shara, after a visit to Gettysburg with his family, decided to make Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain one of the central characters of his novel, when he decided that he wanted to create a sort of American Iliad, a sort of great heroic story of the American past to create a sort of American mythology around. This, of course, became the Killer Angels. Drawing off of Pullen's regimental history, Garish's book, and the official records, we, of course, got The Killer Angels in 1974, published to rave reviews, winning the Pulitzer Prize, and it's never gone out of print. It's assigned reading everywhere from high schools to college history courses to the U.S. Army War College in Carlisle, where it is the only fiction book on the reading list. The Killer Angels was read by Ken Burns, who developed his documentary series The Civil War, the most viewed program in the history of PBS, out of the interest it sparked in the American Civil War in him. Chamberlain, unsurprisingly, became one of the central figures of the documentary and was once again treated as if he were solely alone on Little Round Top with the 20th Maine. Gettysburg, the 1993 Ron Maxwell film based on The Killer Angels, carries the centrality of Chamberlain even further. The British actor Maxwell Caulfield, who portrays Strong Vincent as Chamberlain's superior officer, has about a dozen lines and 8 minutes of screen time in the entire 4-hour director's cut of the film. Meanwhile, Strong Vincent, originally in the 1860s and 70s and 80s, had had a much stronger reputation than Vincent. It was because his death had been so violent, so sudden at Gettysburg, that it had caught attention in the national press. He had been lionized as a hero for a while after his death. But as was rather bluntly put, Chamberlain had the better publicist, Chamberlain himself. And with Vincent's death, it fell to others to support his narrative. Oliver Wilcox Norton, who had been his headquarters bugler and, of course, co-author of the bugle called Taps, fought hard against the rising tide of Chamberlain, to the point where he published the book The Attack and Defense of Round Top in 1904 in an effort to protect Vincent's legacy. Ellis Spear, who had been the acting major of the 20th Maine at Gettysburg and a lifelong friend of Chamberlain, was even repulsed by the amount of credit his friend was taking that he viewed was not due to him, and fought on Norton's behalf to try and lessen the spread of Chamberlain's influence. There's a fantastic quote in correspondence between the two, where Spear tells Norton, "I've known Chamberlain since we were in college in 54 to 58. And he had had the same infirmity then. He is of inability to tell the truth always." Spear would tell Norton that as a member of the Bowdoin College Board of Trustees, he had overheard a group of students talking about Chamberlain, saying that that's the man who fought at Little Round Top. And Chamberlain had overheard them as well and said, "I didn't fight on that hill, I held that hill," which enraged Spear, who said to Norton, "What he should have said is, Vincent held that hill." The two men also complained that the road on the hill should have been named Vincent Avenue. At the time, it had been named Chamberlain Avenue. But while Chamberlain has become visually inseparable from Gettysburg, Strong Vincent has been essentially forgotten. He is mentioned on two waysides on Little Round Top, and a War Department headquarters tablet, and an inscription on a boulder, and a small marble marker marking where he fell mortally wounded. And that's it. Chamberlain, meanwhile, is on blankets, pillows, beers, posters, book covers, action figures, art prints, and everything in between. And that's the lovely end of my presentation there. So I feel I've covered the how we got to where we're at today, as well as the what generally actually happened, which means as to what we can do to sort of correct the record moving forward. I think the most important thing that we can do as historians and as enthusiasts of the American Civil War is to sort of challenge this assertion and this notion of Chamberlain, not out of any malice or any sort of contempt, but because historians and those who value and appreciate history appreciate truth. And truth doesn't get served when everyone chomps just to the 20th Maine's monument at Gettysburg and ignores the monuments of the 44th New York or the 16th Michigan or the 83rd Pennsylvania or the 140th New York. And it doesn't do to think only of the men of the 20th Maine and their losses, and to forget to dwell on the men who were wounded and killed alongside them, as if they never existed at all. And I think with that point, I'll open it up to any questions you might have.
I thought that was a great. Hey, listen, as a fan of Joshua Chamberlain, I think you're doing important work. A lot of stuff that you talked about today kind of shocked me. If anybody has any questions, you can put your hand up, unmute, jump in. You can put it in the chat if you want me to ask a question. I have a question. We'll get this going. So Meade correct my understanding of this. Meade
Yes.
had an original plan that included Little Round Top at the end of the fish hook. Sickles then, in spite of that, for whatever reasons, debated on another presentation, moved that line up. Okay. But it was Strong Vincent that put them back on the hill.
Yes.
That's fascinating. You know, in all the discussions about Sickles and all, I still have never heard Strong Vincent being part of that story. You know, which I think that's a very cool thing. It's kind of shocking to me a little bit, for sure. Does anybody have any questions here? There we go. We got something in the chat here. Mark Bender says, you can't help but wonder how Vincent would have reacted to all of this had he survived the war.
I personally think he wouldn't have made a big deal out of it if he had survived to the end of the war. All signs point to Vincent having been, I don't want to say much more humble than Chamberlain, because as much as I sort of just seemed like I was just ragging on Chamberlain for, 40 minutes, I do still like Joshua Chamberlain. But there's an anecdote I didn't actually bring up. Vincent actually served as head of a court-martial board in the winter of 1862-1863 because he was a lawyer. And he was apparently so good at that, they actually offered him the position of one of the judge advocates of the Army of the Potomac. And he turned it down, even though it would have been a huge boon to his post-war career. It would have been a huge, benefit to his position, his social standing, everything. And he said, I enlisted to fight, and that is what I shall do. And he did not seem as if he was the sort of man who would chase an opportunity, as it were.
What other works have been done more recently, taking, discussing what you're talking about today, trying to take the emphasis away from one regiment and giving it to the entire brigade, like you are?
In terms of Vincent and Chamberlain, I'm the first one to really try and take a whack at this, which is a little intimidating, I will say. I've already gotten one historian who I won't name sort of firing back at me, just sort of, how dare you? I won't name names, but that was a little disheartening to see in his most recent book. But there are other historians who are sort of trying to reorient and reshift the focus, because in a lot of cases, there are instances where historians have just sort of taken one account as gospel for far too long, and it's not borne out by the original sources. The actual inspiration for how I approached this was Frank Varney, who has become a good friend of mine in recent years, formerly of Dickinson State, and his book, General Grant and the Rewriting of History, about how historians for so long have just been so devoted to the version of the Civil War laid out in Grant's memoirs, that if you actually go back and you look at contemporaneous documents and letters and reports and field activity, it doesn't really match up with what Grant says in his memoirs. And the more he dug into it, the more he discovered that Grant really did sort of use his memoirs to sort of discredit and publish generals that he had disliked and disapproved of, most notably William Rosecrans and Gouverneur Warren.
The 3-volume manuals that you cite, with Gettysburg, I guess it's a compilation. What were they called?
The War of the Rebellion being the official records of the Union and Confederate armies.
Has that been republished over the years at all?
Oh, it's been republished quite a bit. The whole series in total is 64 volumes. It is basically every scrap of paper that crossed the desk of either the Union or Confederate war departments throughout the American Civil War. Telegrams, letters, orders, dispatches, after-action reports. It's huge.
Now, has there ever been any revisions made to it? Because it would seem to me that if there was these blatant mistakes done with something that was certified as an original copy, and they were looking for the original copy, and that was their objective, and that this original copy is sitting in a library, you said state library in Vermont?
It's in the State Archives in Augusta, Maine. They were published so long ago, the official records, as they're called for short, were a product of the War Department of the 1880s. That when this, for example, was unearthed in the 1990s, there wasn't really much of an impulse among, the Department of Defense to really go back and amend something they'd done 110 years before. Uh, but there were, a couple of errata listed in later volumes. Just by the way, we said this, we actually meant this. And so they were sort of editing as they went along. Just by the way, we misprinted this, it should have said this. But that is, I think, the most flagrant error that got past the War Department.
You would think at the very least include what would, I mean, are they sure that these are the actual records, the ones that are in Augusta?
It is a copy that was sent by Chamberlain to John Hodgson, who was the Adjutant General of the state of Maine. And it is in the files of the Adjutant General's office. So it is almost certainly the original, given that it is not at all similar to the version that was published in the War of the Rebellion. It's also very unlikely that Chamberlain 20 years later would have thought to himself, oh, yes, there's one in the files of Hodgson and Augusta. I'd better go remember to swap that one out.
Yeah. Yeah, that's something. How long has your book been out?
It came out just a little over 2 years ago, actually.
How are your sales in Maine? I'm just curious.
I don't get regionalized breakdowns. I have no idea how the sales are in Maine, but I feel as if I should never go to the state. I feel as if I would probably be turned away at the border.
Yeah, I didn't get as strong. I see what you were doing, and there's been a lot. You weren't the only one to talk about how Joshua Chamberlain used his war history, and you know what, he can, and to give him fair credit, this is my view of it, he can only talk about himself.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, couldn't you not if you were there?
Yeah.
It's just you couple that with the fact that Strong Vincent was mortally wounded, and
Yeah.
that story wasn't told, and I could kind of see how it was all like a perfect storm for him to get sort of forgotten, because the accounts of the 20th Maine is heroic, touching, actually.
It's absolutely heroic and touching. I actually say I forget how exactly I phrased this. I really should reread my own book before I do one of these, but I forget how exactly I phrased it. But there's something in the book where I say basically it's the story we've all accepted because it's the story we want to be true, because it's the so perfectly gallant, so perfectly heroic story.
Oh, perfect for a movie, don't you think?
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, and who doesn't love Jeff Daniels? So I mean,
Exactly.
it's just, you know. Um, Bill says, has Chamberlain ever written any account of himself of any of his military exploits?
Chamberlain himself wrote a memoir. He wrote two, actually. His first was entitled Bayonet Forward, My Civil War Reminiscences. And I believe that was most recently republished in the 90s. The second and much more famous one is, oh, geez, the title just went right out of my head. But it's his memoir of the Appomattox campaign in particular, and centering on his role in the surrender ceremonies. That's gonna bother me. I can't think of the title right now. I'm so sorry, but he did write two memoirs himself.
Yeah, David just made a comment in here. I very much believe that Chamberlain got more credit for Little Round Top than was warranted. There were certainly many others, such as Vincent, that should have been given credit for what they did there that day. Plus, he believes that what took place on Culp's Hill was just as important with Greene's Brigade and the 137th New York. He did enjoy the presentation very much. David wanted to let you know that.
Oh, well,
So
thank you very much, Dave.
I think you're coming across loud and clear. I did like how in the intro you were like, "This is going to be very controversial," and you almost set it up to be that way. But it's a shame that it's controversial at all. To me, if I had to distill it down, I think it's I could see how you would get flack, but people get flack for terrible reasons. I mean, you're basically a historian who's trying to shine light on something, and all you're doing is you're taking the work of a regiment and giving it, and you're trying to say, let's give the credit to the brigade, and that's not radical, I don't think. And I hope I wish you much success with this publishing, and especially something new. Who's going to put something new out today with the Civil War that's not going that's going to be worthwhile, that it doesn't unearth something new? And then you
Yeah.
have to you have to dislodge what people have been told and believed all these years. So I think you're going to get a little bit of that, but I like what you're doing. I think what you're doing is important, and I think you do it with respect. So I wish you a lot of luck with that.
Hans, could I ask you a question?
Yes, of course.
I saw your talk at in Philadelphia too. And
Yes, I do recognize you. Yes.
yeah, I, like others, have been a lifelong fan of Joshua Chamberlain. We have a house in Maine. I'm there now, actually, and you can't go around the state and not hear Chamberlain, held to the highest standard, especially in Brunswick, Maine, where you can get a Joshua Chamberlain hamburger, a beer. They've got, I mean, he's all over the place there. But I do want to say a couple of things. First of all, I agree that Strong Vincent definitely doesn't get the credit that he deserves. I mean, he died on that hill. And I've read all of Chamberlain's works, and I don't, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think he ever mentioned Strong Vincent and his death on Little Round Top.
Not in anything he ever published.
Yeah, so
he did send a letter at one point to Oliver Norton, who of course had been the headquarters brigade bugler, who published it in his Mollis Military Order of the Loyal Legion paper, Strong Vincent and his brigade at Gettysburg, in which Chamberlain admitted that it is largely due to Vincent and his initiative that the defense of the hill is owed. And that is the only published comment Chamberlain ever offered on Vincent, and it was not even offered directly for publication by Chamberlain himself.
Yeah, I mean, hindsight's always 20/20, but it would have been a lot more gentlemanly of Chamberlain had he recognized, Vincent as a superior officer who died on that hill that day. And I agree with you, but I just want to add some more comments. As you said, Chamberlain was governor of Maine for 4 terms. Back then, terms were only 1 year, so it was 4 years. But he did a lot for Maine veterans of all regiments up here. He actually published a letter to every single surviving Maine veteran up here, signed by the governor himself, thanking them for his service. And if you go to his house, which is now a museum, there's a letter to him from him thanking him for his service. But he also he found money in the state budget to create and erect and place Maine Union soldier sentinels in every town in Maine that had men that fought in the war. I mean, for those of you that ever come to Maine or have come to Maine, it's hard to find a town that doesn't have a sentinel, a stone sentinel to a Maine, Union infantry soldier. The other thing I want to point out is 2 things. I'd like your comments on why Grant chose him to accept the surrender. Did he buy into this myth? And the other thing is, post-war, he did a lot to help rebuild. You didn't mention this, and I don't hold you at fault for it, but he invited General James Longstreet to Maine, to his house, and he really reached out to the other side, so to speak, to try to, contribute what he could to Reconstruction. So if you could comment on those 2 things, I'd appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. As to why Grant chose Chamberlain to accept the surrender, it's not something I've looked into personally with a lot of depth and detail. I have to go with simply the working theory I've had for a while, which is that Grant saw in Chamberlain a sort of kindred spirit in some regards. They were both fairly committed to the ideals of what would eventually become Reconstruction. Of course, Grant would become its most zealous advocate once he became president. And he saw a sort of kindred spirit there in Chamberlain. But he also saw in Chamberlain this sort of gentlemanly figure who would not rub the nose of their defeat, rub the nose of the Confederates in their defeat, because Chamberlain wasn't particularly vindictive in that particular sense, it seems to me. And you're quite correct. He was very outspoken in favor of the idea of reconciliation as well as making inroads in support of Reconstruction, but not to the point of throwing out the baby with the bathwater and going whole hog on reconciliation and pardoning the entire South like Andrew Johnson wanted to do. And his friendship with Longstreet, I've always thought, is just a remarkable example of two men who saw the opportunity for conciliation and cooperation towards a better future at a time when the country wasn't necessarily fully ready for it. And I think there's an excellent book to be written there on the nature of their friendship that I don't think anyone has gotten around to yet.
Okay.
Thanks.
Very nice. Thank you, Mark. That was great. Coming from Maine. That's high praise coming from a guy in Maine right now. So that's
You know, if I just add one more thing, if any of you ever come to Brunswick, Maine, visit his house. It's been fully restored. It used to be a Bowdoin dorm, and it was a mess, but it's been fully restored, and all of his stuff is there. The boots that he was wearing when he was shot at Gettysburg, where he had the insole repaired. They had the cannonballs. They have everything, and it's really worth seeing it. Also, if you go to the Bowdoin Library, you can ask to see all the medals he received, including his Congressional Medal of Honor and all the jewelry that he made for his wife when she passed.
His wife.
She donated it to Bowdoin, and it's really neat to see all that stuff. Just FYI, if you're ever up here.
Okay, Michael wants to know.
Brian,
Go ahead, Miriam.
Hmm.
Go ahead.
do you want to take the? Well, I was just going to say, Mr. Bender. Yes, I've been there, and thank you, Mr. Meyers. I also am a General Chamberlain fan, but I love your review, especially since I'm a true Pennsylvanian and strong Vincent. Unfortunately, I think if he would have lived or survived longer in the war, he might have been recognized. One of the things, and you did point this out, was that with the movie Gettysburg and Killer Angels, I think that really put another emphasis, I guess, on General Chamberlain. And I know later in years that Ellis Spear and him, Chamberlain, did have a little feud too between themselves about the actual history of the regiment. I think one of the things with the 20th Maine was that, and I could be wrong because I'm not a strategist or, had the keenness battle, outlaw, was that he refused the line. I think that at that time that maybe that wasn't used, that tactic. But I thank you again. I think all the points that you brought up was very interesting, and I'm going to get around to reading your book and purchasing your book. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much.
That's great. Michael wants to know if General Meade ever addressed the Chamberlain-Vincent controversy in his official report. I would like to know if at all if Meade ever made any comments. I think that's a good question about this.
Meade never weighed in on the controversy between the two men. He had bigger fish to fry, as it were. And by the time that this was really starting to erupt post-war, he had sort of stepped away and stepped back into private life. But if push came to shove and he had gotten involved, I do believe Meade would have been very firmly on Vincent's side, because prior to Gettysburg, Meade was immensely fond of Strong Vincent. He had, of course, been his commanding officer in the Fifth Corps immediately prior to Gettysburg. And during the march up to Gettysburg, Meade received a request for infantry support from the Federal Cavalry Commander Pleasanton to send a brigade to assist with fighting Confederate cavalry who were dismounting and fighting behind stone walls to harass, Federal troopers as they were attempting to find where the Army of Northern Virginia had gone. And Meade sent Vincent's brigade to help. And at the Battle of Aldie in mid-June 1863, Vincent and his infantry brigade actually shifted the tide of battle so decisively that they delivered the first real defeat Jeb Stuart and his troopers had suffered in the entire war, to the point where Federal cavalry forces captured their first piece of Confederate cavalry artillery that they had captured in the entire war during the battle. And Vincent got so much praise from the cavalry commanders in their reports, and in Vincent's own report, his summation of events was just so thoroughly detailed, so methodical. Meade is reported to have just read it and put it down and sighed to his staff, "I wish he was a brigadier general. I'd put him in command of a division." And when Vincent was mortally wounded, the next morning, early the next morning, July 3rd, before, of course, the fracas of the day erupted, Meade sent a headquarters telegram speeding off to Washington. Specifically, the only content of this message was to say to Henry Halleck at the War Department, "Strong Vincent of the 83rd Pennsylvania has been mortally wounded. I am requesting his promotion to brigadier general as a courtesy and tribute to him and his heroism, for it would much gratify his friends. I had intended to do this anyway, should he have lived."
That's fascinating. I just wanted to ask you, um, was there really a Strong Vincent, Joshua Chamberlain controversy until, say, now? I mean, who was going, well, wait a minute back then? Chamberlain was doing his thing. Was there a controversy really ever?
I think controversy may be too strong of a word for it. There was certainly some tension. Ellis Spear, I know, took particular umbrage at Chamberlain taking so much of the credit for the victory at Little Round Top, and Oliver Norton. But they were very much the minority. It was very much, I hate to say this, it was very much just two old men yelling about a third old man, basically, in the eyes of most of the public, because most of the public just accepted the version of events laid out by Joshua Chamberlain. I mean, it was being carried in Cosmopolitan and Hearst magazines. It must be true. There wasn't really much of a pushback against the Chamberlain narrative. And Spear and Norton tried, and they attempted to preserve Vincent's legacy, but they were very much fighting a losing battle. And so I think controversy might be too strong of a word for it, but there was an effort to sort of correct the narrative even as it was unfolding.
Yeah, I would say that if there's a controversy in the proper strength of the word, it might be only because of maybe some reactions you get now that are unwarranted if they pay attention close to what you're doing. So you're the one who's who's finally bringing this to people's attention, saying, "Hey, I think this got a little carried away." So I appreciate the work you're doing. Does anybody have any more questions before we depart on our Sunday afternoon? Is there anything else you would like to add, Hans?
If no one has any more questions, I'd just like to thank you all once more for giving me a round and hour and a quarter of your time on this afternoon that I hope is nicer weather for you in the Philadelphia area or in Maine in Mark's case than it is for me.
Yes, thank you very much. I appreciate it, and I thank everybody here that comes and supports our guests here, and this supports the museum and get the word out there. It's all important work, and I think what you've done is important work as well. And we'll make sure to plug the book well during the video edit. We'll have a picture of it and provide a link to where people can pick it up. So, and I'll send you a copy of that too. Okay.
Thank you.
All right. God bless. God bless everybody. Thank you so
Everybody.
much.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
Thank you.